Welcome, everybody. It is Business Monday here at Go Local Live. Monday afternoon, I am here with Cha-ching, Gary Sasse, the money man. He was out in some secret mission for somebody last week. He is back this week. We are talking every possible fiscal policy known to mankind, federal, state, local, intergalactic. We've got it all going on. Let's bring it here to Rhode Island. We've chatted a little bit over the last couple of weeks, but there's certainly some indicators. Job losses for the last 4 months, not major. Len Ladaro is showing some numbers cooling. Some other people are. What's your take on the state of the Rhode Island economy?
I think a black cloud is descending over the economy of the state.
We don't like black clouds.
Oh, I think a gray cloud is descending over the state. No, there was some work done by the Regional Economic Studies Group at Bryant, which is Professor Eddie Tibaldi, who we work very closely with. And just to take a second to summarize and highlight some data. So first, if you look at gross domestic product, for the fourth quarter, Oz is going to grow by 0.2%.
Rhode Island's is going to grow by 0.2%.
The United States, 2.6%.
Yeah, so slightly off the.
Slightly off the map.
We're dead flat, and they're almost at, and the rest of the country is almost at 3%.
And well, Massachusetts is a little under 1%, but we're about 1/5 of Massachusetts. So our gross domestic product is not growing. The indicators are that the growth will also be slow in the first quarter of 19. If you look at jobs, you mentioned what Professor Ladaro spoke about, and the numbers are really startling. If you look at growth, just February over February, 1 year, I'm not going to go way back, of actual payroll employment. That means the number of jobs in Rhode Island. There were more jobs a year ago than there are today. If you look at the labor force has not grown since Gina's been governor.
Say that again, because the governor says we're at record employment, blah, 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 blah.
The labor force has not grown for several years. I think there were about 555,000 people in the labor force 4 or 5 years ago. There's about the same number now. I don't think there's much difference. And so what becomes very interesting, our unemployment rate has come down. When the governor came into office, our unemployment rate was about 6.5%. It's under 4% right now, but it didn't necessarily come down because we were creating so many jobs. The labor force was pretty staid in terms of growth. And so those have to be of concern. No growth in gross domestic product. Labor force is not growing significantly. Even if you want to look at unemployment, which is, you have to be much more sophisticated, we're still 33rd in the nation in terms of our unemployment percentage. And so the people at Bryant and the people at RIPIC who wrote this study characterized the economy as stagnant. They characterized the economy as underperforming our peers. Those are quotes that they use. Those are not my quotes. And so now the question is why and what are we doing about it? And certainly it's difficult. These are not easy challenges. So there are things that you all can't control, but the fundamental structural problems remain. We've talked about these before. No population growth.
No, literally no population growth in decades.
And if you don't have people, you can't have economic growth.
Right.
Because the rabbits and the squirrels are not great indicators of economic growth. So there's no population growth. There's the out-migration of skilled, workers. We've talked about a problem with our education system. Just hired a new education commissioner.
Right.
There was hope when you do that. So my question would be, and I don't want to answer this. So we've created a Department of Commerce, or a Commerce Rhode Island, and they do what other state commerce departments do. I'm not going to get off on them and say they make mad decisions, but they become a giant real estate company. And the programs that they do have that deal with the structural problem, not necessarily their fault, but they're not at scale. And so there's some fancy titles, some programs that seem to have a good direction, but they're not touching enough people. They're not big enough. We're not investing in those kinds of programs. And the second issue that's kind of structural, but we've known this going back to Michael Porter's work at Harvard in the late 1980s. If you want to grow an economy and you want to create jobs, you have to create business clusters.
Right.
And you have to create entrepreneurial clusters. And you don't have really economic development.
Well, let me ask you a question. Just reading KPMG came out with their analysis of where the next tech booms are going to happen. This was globally. Boston's identified as one of the hot cities outside of Silicon Valley. You know, and this was a global look. January, Massachusetts created 11,000 jobs. We lost jobs. February numbers, the nation only created 20,000 jobs. Massachusetts was up 6,000 of those 20,000 jobs. We were down jobs. Why isn't, you know, we've talked about this sort of regional economy. Why isn't Massachusetts' explosion, growth, clusters having more of an impact on Rhode Island's economy?
Well, it's how you measure that impact. And I'm not sure it's not having an impact because I mentioned...
Because of good train tickets going up to MBTA up to Boston?
Well, think about it this way. We have about 555,000 people in our labor force. About 535,000 people in that labor force are employed, so the unemployment rate is about 20,000 people on that labor force, which is not a problem. Well, if we're not growing jobs in Rhode Island, these people are working somewhere.
Yeah.
And so...
They're on the train.
So you ask what the impact of Massachusetts is, just ask yourself a second question. What would this place look like if it wasn't close to Massachusetts? So I've never measured it. I can't talk intelligently about, you know, what the impact of Massachusetts is, but you've got to be a blind man not to see that it's had some impact. Now, you could say, why has it had more impact? And I can't answer that question because I can't measure that. But that certainly has affected us. The bigger issue, and these are hard problems, they're hard for a small state. Keep in mind, we're a state of 1 million people. We're a state of 45 miles from one end to the other. So those are built-in limitations, no matter how well the state is run. But the more important question you ought to be asking, even if we failed, why don't we have an economic development strategy and tactics to achieve that strategy? And my concern, ever since the day one of Commerce for Rhode Island, was when you looked at the myriad of tax incentive programs, you and I can argue which ones are good and which ones are bad and which ones are priorities, and that's politics, so we could pay our dime and take our choice on that. So put that argument aside, and if you give me an hour, I can have plenty of conversation why I don't think they've done a good job in selecting projects. But that's besides the point. But the bigger question is, okay, that's part of an economic development portfolio. So other states do that we're doing that. But why have we let education slip? You know, why haven't, in attracting industry and business to the state, we haven't been more cluster-oriented and more tactical in using these incentives, these preferential deals? And I know it's hard, but you have to be measured after 4 or 5 years of what the outcomes have been and what the projected outcomes to be are. And there's not an economist at a university in the state, you know, at Bryant, you mentioned an economist at URI and other places, who are not reading the same tea leaves.
Yeah, and they're, economists have predicted 9 of the last 4 recessions, but they are definitely hitting the panic button right now, close to the panic button. They are raising deep concerns about the state of Rhode Island's economy, that it's already tipping, and that there's some, you talk about planning and clusters. Is it too late? I mean, shouldn't this pivot, we wish it had taken place 4, 6, or 8 years ago, depending on who the governor was or is. Should that pivot now be taking place, that we're really identifying what our strengths and weaknesses are, and we're identifying what's leverageable, and we're investing in those sectors? Because I will agree with you, if you look at that laundry list of 30-something companies that Commerce RI has invested in over the last 5 years, there's a lot of hotels, there's a lot of development. And after that, I'm not sure there's any discernible predictability as to what has been invested in.
Well, there are other projects too. That's just the Rebuild Rhode Island program. And there are other things. There's a jobs credit, and there are other tools that they have. And the question is, you know, have we been using them in the right places? Have we been meeting our targets? You know, what have been our targets? Before we started using the Rebuild Rhode Island money, was our target to spend money or was our target to rebuild certain kinds of infrastructure and certain kinds of businesses?
Sure.
I don't know the answer to that question. I haven't seen an economic strategy plan put out to say that, okay, we're going to give tax incentives, preferential tax deals for real estate development, and we're going to use 50% for this, or manufacturing will say, well, 20% for manufacturing. Numbers are not important. And at the end of 4 years, I could sit back and say, okay, you know, we may not have had the results we wanted, but our goal was to spend 20% of our money for manufacturing.
Right.
We spent 20% for manufacturing. Maybe we have to spend 40% next year. And so what a layman like me sees looking in from the outside is basically deals, transactions. And like in any transaction, there are good transactions, there are bad, there's some successful, some unsuccessful, but there's no, the dots are not being connected. And so you ask the question, I think it's time after 4 years to sit back and say, what have we done well in economic development? What can we do better? Where should we be investing our monies? What's the tactic and strategy for the use of those investments? And I don't hear that conversation going on. I hear a lot of defensiveness going on. I hear people spinning numbers, and I could spin these numbers differently, and somebody sitting on my left could even spin them a third kind of way. But that's not going to get, leadership is concerned about the spin, and there ought not be any political concern because the election's over.
Right.
I mean, this is not a question of anybody's political future. The election's over. Now we have the real opportunity to govern, and economic development is critical. We've recognized our problems. I think we did a good job in recruiting a new commissioner of education. Seems to have the right attitude and right skills to deal with the kinds of problems that we face here in Rhode Island. Let's see how that works out. Let's give that person their win so they can go ahead and sail.
Let's go up to the General Assembly for a second. I think both when I have conversations with influential legislators or staff up there, I think Kate Nagel, news editor, would say the same thing. There is a lot of frustration about the state of the state's budget, and that the budget is in a very difficult situation, that the governor's proposal had a lot more holes than they anticipated. I think they expect revenue to be flat or may have some more complications. Sports betting looks to be an absolute catastrophic loser, no two ways about it. It's supposed to be $23.5 million of new money. I think we're now 6 months, 7 months, 8 months into the fiscal year. It was 3 months late. Just count the last 3 months in which revenue has been reported. And I think we're flat or underwater on the net of what that has generated. Marijuana, I think there's a lot of questions about. It's supposed to generate $6 million in new revenue. I think there's a question there as to what it will generate and what it will cost to regulate it. We've talked about it before. Could there be a new strategy on how to develop some budget analysis and actions that breaks the cycle of week to week, month to month budget management?
Yeah, it's called leadership. It's called making tough decisions. So think about a budget two ways. One part of a budget is how you spend money.
Yep.
And that's not political. That shouldn't be political. I mean, maybe small p political because somebody gets their ox scored here or there.
Right, right.
A certain guy didn't get a contract or gets a contract, but it's not political in the policy sense. And there are questions that the legislature is raising of how we're spending our money. Mm-hmm. Are we spending our money efficiently? Why did the governor submit a budget and have a phantom $10 million efficiency savings? Efficiency ought to be one of the foundations that the budget is built on, and looking at the out-year forecasts and looking at the uncertainties that we face, they have really dropped the ball on how money is being spent. Second issue is where the money and what the money is spent on. Now those are political decisions. Mm-hmm. Those are choices. There's no absolutes. You and I may agree or disagree. I may agree that we didn't need to expand Medicaid. We should put more money in education, and somebody could have a counter view, which is just as reasonable. So there's two things that we're not doing. We're not having a conversation on how we're doing, and so all the questions the legislature is raising about holes in the budget, you reflect that, not so much policy, because the legislature's hands are not clean on the policy choices, because they've approved every one of those policies that the governor
absolutely.
has gone forward with. And then the second question is, if this is where it gets political and philosophical. I'm a fiscal conservative. I would not spend money on new programs until I adequately funded my existing responsibilities. And that's not the attitude up there right now. The attitude up there is, no, we're going to spend money on good programs, pre-K, Promise, expanding this social program or that social program. And if we can't fund it, then we're going to go back to the old paradigm of increasing taxes and spending. Well, this is where it really breaks down. If you have a deficit and you increase revenue, and the revenue is used to bring down the deficit, that's one reason of increasing revenue. If you have a deficit and you increase taxes to pay for new programs, you never catch up. Never catch up. And so that's where we're at.
When Sunland was governor, he left it to the departments. He said, give me a budget, you can identify your priorities with a 5% cut, a 10% cut, and a 15% cut. Left it to the department directors to make those decisions. And then in the budget process, before he turned it over to the legislature, they made decisions. DEM might get cut 15%, and economic development might only get cut 5%.
I was there. We had a DEM director who was a great director, but she lost her job because she didn't like the way we do with the budget.
That's right.
She didn't want to make those cuts. I put Sunland's first budget together. And then this is the lack of let me give you an example. And I hate people like myself say this is how we used to do it.
Right.
Governor Sunland came in November. We were facing a big deficiency. We passed a supplemental budget the day before the legislature adjourned for Washington's birthday for that resource, because there was a sense of urgency. There was teamwork. The governor insisted.
Well, it was also catastrophic. You had a banking crisis. You had a budget deficit of $300 or $400 million.
Well, I don't think it was that high, but it was pretty high.
Well, I think it was $300 or $400 million.
We increased some taxes too, but the point that makes the story more valid. Because,
right, absolutely.
Because if the deficit is only $100 million and not $300 million, this should be a piece of cake.
Right.
But the other thing too is, the other thing is we've cut things so close. So we don't look at how we're doing. Politically, everything is good. So we make yes for every choices, and then try to raise money on top of a deficit. And we cut things so close that when there's a slightest downtick, we have a crisis. So let me give you an example. The latest report from the Department of Revenue, the Office of Revenue Analysis, projects that based on the revised revenue figures that came out in November for the current fiscal year, we're running $33 million behind. We're running $46 million behind in terms of tax revenue. Well, on a $9 billion budget or on a $4 billion general fund budget, that's 2.3% on tax revenue, about 1.4% on revenue. That's not, anything under 2% is not terrible revenue estimating.
Right.
But because we have no room for contingencies, when our revenues start to fall behind by 1% or 1.5%, we're thrown into crisis. And we have to make these tough choices that no one wants to make, and they should have made originally. So I get back to the question of budgeting. I don't think there's anything better or worse than the professionals that do budgeting here. I think they're as good as anyone I've seen. I don't think there's anything wrong with the systems. You can talk about structural change and talk about biennial budgeting, and there are things that we could probably do better. You could talk about, more as program-type budget. But by and large, our budget is a normal garden variety public budget. People that put the budget together are capable, competent professionals. Part of the problem is driven by the economy and the structure that we work from, but also a big part of it's driven by a lack of political will to make tough choices, a lack of logic. How can you defend expanding a program for universal pre-K or for Promise college when you have half your schools and more than half in urban areas that can't teach a kid how to read by the 3rd grade? You have to set priorities, you have to stick with those priorities, and you have to hold people accountable. And we don't do that. We announce programs, we appropriate money for those programs, enough money doesn't come in, we try to increase fees and taxes, and then the legislature gets nervous. Who've been a co-conspirator in this thing, they say, oh, we can't increase beach fees, or we can't increase this fee or that fee. Well, damn it, you approve the spending, you approve the concept of those programs, and so what's your suggestion? And,
let's jump over in the last couple of minutes. GOP, I know you were not at the GOP convention. There's actually photos that showed a whole bunch of people actually in the room. I think the Republicans were very excited that they had a whole bunch of people in a room on a Saturday morning.
I wish they had many people vote for them the last time they had election.
They've elected a new chairwoman, Sue Cienki, to lead the party and rebuild it. What's your thought of the state of the two-party system in Rhode Island?
Well, we don't have a two-party system in Rhode Island, so that's an easy question to answer.
So all 5 general officers are Democrats. All 4 members of the congressional delegation are Democrats. Obviously, both sides of the General Assembly are, and we're down to only one mayor who's a Republican. So,
and he lost in the fight for the chairmanship, so he's not a very strong Republican anymore.
It is not the strongest day of the GOP. But don't you have to crash to bottom before you can rebuild?
Well, but the question is how long you want to be on the bottom.
Right.
You know, like anything else, it's election of a new head, new leader of an organization, and so you know, one should not start out pessimistic. One should start out, you know, optimistic. I think some of the initial comments have been helpful, have been more focused than I can remember in some time. That the party is going to focus on electing members of the General Assembly. Every time they get into endorsing candidates for statewide office, they make half the party mad, and it screws up. So that, you know, they have that. The new leader, there's a sense of focus. You know, anytime there's a new leader, there's new energy. You have to capitalize on that energy. That energy dissipates very quickly. It's not going to last a long time. So, you know, I have a wait-and-see attitude. I think the one thing that's the elephant in the room, if I can use that expression.
Of course, for the Republicans,
yeah.
Of course you could.
Well, it's Trump.
Yeah.
And the thing I get concerned about is I see too much in the party of loyalty to Trump and not loyalty to sound Republican principles of governing. And I don't know how they're going to, that's their challenge. I don't know how they're going to deal with that challenge. But, you know, at this point, there's no reason to be negative. It's to be hopeful and hope that energy is translated into accomplishment.
The money man, Gary Sasse, thank you as always. A pleasure you being here. Hopefully folks within the governor's office were listening and will take heed. We're going to be right back in about 30 seconds with one of the partners from one of the fastest growing CPA firms, I think, in the free world. We'll be right back.